For half a century, Burt Lancaster was the face of American perfection, the fearless hero, the man every woman desired and every man wanted to be. But the private photos discovered decades later tell another story. One of longing, secrecy, and a silence that cost him his soul. In the spotlight, he smiled like he owned the world. Behind closed doors, he lived as if someone was always watching. There were the glamorous parties no one dared to speak about, the women who followed him everywhere, and one woman he saved from death, only to lose her forever. He was adored, yet feared. Charismatic, yet cruel. A man who could make the world fall in love, and then vanish behind his own mask. They said he was the perfect leading man. He knew he was only playing a part. And when the cameras stopped rolling, the silence around him grew louder than any applause. Stay until the end. The truth behind this legend may surprise you. The rise of Burt Lancaster felt like a scene written by destiny itself. Born from the dust of a circus tent, he arrived in Hollywood with the body of an athlete and the eyes of a dreamer. In the late 1940s and early 50s, his every movement carried precision. The way he leaped, smiled, even the way he stood. Studios quickly recognized it. Burt Lancaster wasn't just an actor. He was the new symbol of masculine perfection. Posters called him the man's man. Magazines described him as America's strength in human form. He played soldiers, pirates, lovers, men who stood tall while others fell, and the audience believed every frame. Behind the camera, the studio machine polished that image until it gleamed. A faithful husband, a loyal friend, the man who could do no wrong. Yet those who worked closest to him saw the cracks first. The smile didn't always reach his eyes. Between takes, he would fall into sudden silence, staring into space as if he'd forgotten who he was supposed to be. His assistants whispered about sleepless nights and unending control. He reviewed scenes obsessively, adjusted lights, rewrote dialogue, refused to rest until everything fit his own invisible standard. To the world, he was perfection. To himself, he was a prisoner of it. And then came the whispers. The so-called assistant squad. Beautiful young women who followed him from set to set, always close, always loyal. Some said they were there to manage his mood. Others said they were part of a myth carefully maintained by the studio. If Lancaster was seen surrounded by women, no one would question what he was hiding. As applause thundered around him, Burt Lancaster began to sense the illusion tightening like a noose. Every smile, every headline, every photo became another layer of disguise. He had conquered fame, but fame had quietly conquered him. Behind perfection, something began to break. It happened quietly, as all irreversible things do. One evening in the early 1950s, on a studio lot shimmering with cigarette smoke and champagne laughter, Burt met Shelley Winters. She wasn't like the women who hovered around him, trained to flatter or obey. Shelley was bold, magnetic, unpredictable, a woman who looked him in the eye and refused to be dazzled by the myth. He had been married for years, playing his public role to perfection, the devoted husband, the reliable star. But that night, under the soft blur of studio lights, something in him shifted. The laughter between them came too easily, the silence too deep. For once, someone saw the man behind the legend and didn't flinch. In her presence, Burt dropped his armor. He spoke of exhaustion, of always being watched, of never belonging to himself. Shelley listened, not with pity but with understanding. They began meeting in secret, Hotel rooms, rain-soaked streets, brief weekends stolen between film sets. For her, he was a force of nature, passionate, generous, terrifyingly alive. For him, she was oxygen, the only space where he didn't have to pretend. But every embrace carried the scent of danger. Hollywood was no place for truth. The studio machine could destroy anyone who broke its illusion of purity. Their affair was whispered about in hallways, coded in gossip columns, disguised as late-night rehearsals. One night, Shelley almost didn't wake up. Pills, despair, exhaustion, no one knew for sure. Burt and their mutual friend, Farley Granger, broke into her home and carried her to the hospital. He stayed by her side, trembling, whispering her name, as if saying it could keep her alive. For a few moments, the mask fell away, and what remained was only fear and love. She survived, but something inside him did not. In that silence between them, something irreversible began. Their love existed only in the spaces where no one could see. In the late hours, when the city fell silent and rain streaked the windows of her small apartment, Burt Lancaster would arrive in secret. No entourage, no flashbulbs, only the faint scent of cigarettes and wet pavement following him through the door. Shelley Winters would open her arms without words. In those moments, they were no longer actor and actress, husband and mistress, only two wounded souls clinging to something they both knew could not last. He spoke to her about the emptiness behind fame, how every smile felt rehearsed, every touch scripted. She told him she wanted to be loved by the man, not the legend. For a few hours, they both believed it was possible, but daylight always betrayed them. Every morning, he returned to the world that owned him. The wife waiting at home, the studio demanding purity, the press hungry for perfection. Shelley felt the distance growing with each goodbye, her heart trapped between desire and guilt. She began to realize that loving Burt Lancaster meant disappearing into the shadow of his image. Then came the breaking point. News arrived that Norma Anderson, his wife, was pregnant. Shelley stood in the rain that night, the lilies on her table already wilting. She understood this love had no place in the world they lived in. She wrote him a short note. "You saved my life once. Now I'm saving yours." And she walked away. Burt never spoke of her again. But those who knew him said that every time he filmed a love scene, a certain sadness crossed his eyes, a quiet, aching hesitation before each kiss. The rain had stopped outside, but inside, the guilt never did. But the rain never washed away the guilt. Fame had its own kind of gravity, and by the mid-1950s, it was pulling Burt Lancaster into a world where even silence had a price. The whispers started as background noise. The secret parties high in the Hollywood hills. The women who traveled with him everywhere. The photos that quietly vanished before they reached the tabloids. The studio publicists were relentless. They built and protected the myth. The faithful husband, the charming star, the perfect man America needed to believe in. But behind closed doors, that perfection trembled. He lived under a constant, invisible light, a light that could ruin him if it ever turned the wrong way. Every rumor became a question, every friendship a risk. Even the smallest gesture could be misunderstood. In the dressing room mirror, he'd stare at his own reflection for minutes, practicing a smile that didn't look afraid. He began to understand that Hollywood wasn't about acting. It was about containment. Keep the story clean. Keep the image straight. Keep the audience dreaming. And so he learned to hide. When the press hinted about his assistant squad, he invited photographers to lunch with him and his wife. When gossip columnists wrote of private gatherings, he posed for charity photos the next day, shaking hands with children and soldiers. Every denial became another layer of armor, yet the fear never left. It followed him through hotel corridors, through midnight phone calls, through every quiet moment after a shoot. What if one photograph survived? What if one voice decided to speak? The threat wasn't exposure itself. It was the constant waiting for it. Burt Lancaster, the man who once ruled the screen with confidence, began to flinch at the sound of a camera shutter. His greatest performance was no longer in front of the lens. It was pretending he had nothing to hide. Which hurts more, to be seen or to keep pretending? Every legend has a moment when the curtain falls, not in front of millions, but in a room where no one is watching. For Burt Lancaster, it happened twice. The first was with Shelley Winters. She left quietly, without demanding closure. After years of passion and secrecy, she walked away before the world could humiliate them both. Her final words to him were soft, but merciless. We were never real, only brave enough to pretend. He stood by the window for hours that night. The city lights reflected on his face. The rain had stopped, but the silence was louder than ever. The man who could command armies on screen couldn't say a single word to make her stay. The second farewell came not from love, but from pride, the kind that cuts deeper than heartbreak. Kirk Douglas had been his brother in every sense but blood. Together, they built an empire of golden age masculinity, guns blazing, eyes fearless. Yet one afternoon, in front of a laughing crowd, Burt betrayed him with a cruel joke about Kirk's height. A joke that made the room roar and made Kirk Douglas freeze. Behind the curtain, Kirk cried, not from humiliation, but from the sting of losing the one friend he trusted most. For years, they avoided each other. On set, their silences were sharper than dialogue. When asked about that day, Burt said only one thing. I meant to tease. I didn't realize I'd touched something sacred. That was Burt Lancaster's curse. He could conquer the world, but not his own heart. The people who loved him eventually left, not because they stopped caring, but because they could no longer breathe in the orbit of his control. When the applause faded, he was left with the echo, the sound of goodbyes he'd never learned to answer. We're living in a dream that isn't real. Long before the fame, before the cameras, Burt Lancaster was a boy who could balance on a thin wire stretched over dust and silence. The circus was his first home, a place where applause came only after the risk, where you earned love by never falling. Maybe that was what shaped him. The hunger to stay upright, no matter the height. Years later, at the peak of his career, he walked away from it all, from the mansions, from the endless film sets, and returned to a traveling circus in the Midwest. For 4 weeks, the world's most powerful actor worked for $3 a day, sleeping in a trailer, eating with the crew, performing flips under torn canvas. No reporters, no entourage, no lights. When asked why, he said softly, because in the circus, if you fall for real. It was the closest he ever came to freedom. But freedom never lasts in Hollywood. Soon he returned to the cameras, leaner, tanned, with eyes that carried both weariness and light. He starred in Trapeze, the film that immortalized his past, but also trapped him again in the golden cage of success. Behind the scenes, his marriage to Norma Anderson endured, not from passion, but from duty. She had been the woman he once begged to make an impossible choice, and the one who refused. Out of that refusal came their child, their home, their quiet, complicated bond. In public, they were the perfect family. In private, they were two survivors bound by shared history more than love. As the years rolled on, Lancaster aged into authority. No longer the rebel acrobat, but the silver-haired patriarch of American cinema. He learned to speak softly, to let silence say what words could not. Yet those who met him in his later years said that sometimes, when he watched old circus reels, he smiled differently, like a man who still remembered the feeling of wind against his skin before the world demanded perfection. He lived many lives, but one heart never healed. There was no final confession, no tell-all memoir, no book to decode the man behind the myth. Burt Lancaster left behind no letters addressed to anyone, only silence, deliberate and immaculate. But sometimes, silence is a letter. Every word he refused to say became its own message, folded carefully inside the life he performed so well. He understood that mystery was power. While others bared their souls in interviews, he smiled and deflected. When a journalist once asked about his family, he answered with disarming calm, "The public buys tickets to see my movies, not to know who I have breakfast with." It sounded polite, even witty, but beneath that charm lay exhaustion, the fatigue of a man who had spent decades hiding behind the mask of his own invention. Friends remembered the strange loneliness that followed him, even in rooms full of people. He could light up a crowd, but retreat into silence the moment the laughter stopped. His co-stars said he never fully trusted anyone again. Too many headlines, too many half-truths. Hollywood had taught him that love and exposure were the same word written in different ink. In his final years, Lancaster avoided questions about the past. He dismissed rumors with a soft grin, never confirming, never denying. Yet one of his daughters later admitted, "My father carried things he never let go of. He wanted to be known, but only as a legend, not as a man. That was his secret. He spent a lifetime controlling the story, until even he could no longer tell where the performance ended. And somewhere within that silence lay the truest version of him. A man who once dreamed of freedom, then became trapped inside the legend that set him free. When you hide long enough, even the people who love you no longer know who you are. The sound of paper rustles, as if a letter is being folded and sealed, but never sent. In the end, Burt Lancaster's world grew quieter, not with defeat, but with distance. The man who once filled cinemas with thunder now lived behind drawn curtains, his voice softer, his steps slower. The crowds had faded, the applause long dissolved into the hum of passing years. Yet even in that stillness, there was a strange dignity, as if he had finally found the peace he'd spent his whole life pretending to have. Those who visited him in his final months spoke of a room filled with old photographs, black and white moments of laughter, co-stars, family, and faces long gone. He never said much. Sometimes he'd hold a photo between his fingers for a long while, smiling at a memory that no one else in the room could reach. It wasn't nostalgia that filled his eyes. It was recognition, the quiet acceptance of the man he had been and the masks he had worn. He no longer chased perfection. He no longer needed the world to love him. All he wanted, it seemed, was to be remembered for something real. One evening, as dusk settled over Los Angeles, a nurse heard him murmur a single line, so faint it might have been mistaken for breath. "I still think of her. No one asked who her was. It could have been Shelley. It could have been Norma. Or perhaps it was the version of himself he lost somewhere between fame and silence. In that whisper, the legend finally spoke without performance. A man stripped of every script, every lie, every light. The applause was gone. The spotlight dimmed. But for the first time, he seemed true. The clock ticked once. Then the room fell still. What remained was only quiet, the kind that follows when a life has finally exhaled its last secret. In the golden haze of memory, Burt Lancaster no longer feels like a man. He feels like a myth carved into the silver frame of old Hollywood. But myths are never born perfect. They are built from longing, from mistakes, from hearts that refused to stop breaking. He once said that fame was a mirror that always lies. Maybe that's why he kept his own image so carefully guarded. Not out of vanity, but out of fear that the truth would shatter what millions needed to believe. He was the hero, the lover, the lion of American cinema. Yet beneath every role was the same unspoken ache, the cost of becoming unforgettable. Those who knew him still speak of his contradictions. He was generous and cruel, magnetic and distant, a man who could make you feel chosen one moment and invisible the next. He lived surrounded by people, yet died surrounded by silence. And perhaps that was his truest self, a performer who spent his life teaching the world how to dream, even as he quietly forgot how to rest. His films remain. From Here to Eternity, Trapeze, Elmer Gantry. Echoes of a man chasing grace through every frame. Each role was a confession disguised as courage. Each close-up, a fragment of a truth he could never say aloud. Now, decades later, his story lingers not in scandal or legend, but in something far more human. The yearning to be loved without the need to pretend. Because when the lights fade and the audience leaves, what endures is not fame. It's the tenderness we hide and the forgiveness we never found the courage to ask for. True love doesn't need to last forever, only deep enough never to fade. So tell me, which legend still lives in your heart? When the screen goes dark, only one thing remains: the feeling a story leaves behind. If this journey stirred something quiet inside you, stay with us. Here, every forgotten legend has a heartbeat. Every silence hides a truth worth hearing. We create these films not just to remember the stars, but to remind you that beauty still lives in the spaces between light and shadow. Let's keep those memories alive, together, one story at a time.